The rope creaked in the cold February dark, a sound swallowed by the Missouri woods. The body of Ben Bolin swung from the limb of a white oak, a grim pendulum marking the end of a bloody Ozark chapter. To the men who put him there, he was a monster, a tyrant who terrorized the hills under the guise of justice. But just a few years earlier, many of those same men, or their neighbors, would have called him a savior, a dark angel sent to deliver them from chaos. So which was he? A righteous crusader who lost his way? Or a brutal killer who simply found the right mask to wear? Today, we're not just telling the story of a vigilante's death. We're peeling back over 100 years of rumor and legend to find the man himself, to understand how the iron fist of the bald nobbers became a ghost, forever riding the haunted backroads of the Ozarks. To understand the firestorm that was the bald nobbers, you must first walk through the world they burned down. Imagine the Ozarks in the 1880s. This wasn't a land of gentle hills and quaint cabins. It was a fortress built by nature. Light struggled to pierce the dense canopy of oak and hickory, leaving the hollows in a state of perpetual twilight. Creeks cut through limestone like silver knives, their waters running cold and clear. A man could get lost a mile from his own home and never be found. The land was beautiful, but it was a hard, unforgiving beauty that demanded respect and bred a deep sense of isolation. The people were as rugged as the land they worked. They were farmers, loggers, and hunters, their hands calloused and their faces etched by sun and hardship. Their lives were governed by the rhythm of the seasons, ploughing the rocky soil in the spring, enduring the suffocating humidity of summer, harvesting their meager crops in the fall, and hunkering down for the long, cold winter. Their world was small, often no larger than the valley where they were born. A trip to the county seat in Forsyth was a major event. The law, headquartered in some far-off city like Springfield, was less than a rumor. It was a ghost, a thing that had no power here. But beneath this quiet surface of toil and survival, the poison of the past was still at work. The Civil War had never truly ended in these hills. It had simply shattered into 1,000 personal feuds. Neighbor had fought neighbor as bushwhackers and jayhawkers, and the memories of burned-out farms and midnight raids were passed down from father to son like a cursed inheritance. Trust was a rare commodity, usually reserved for immediate kin. At night, heavy wooden bars were dropped across cabin doors, and the sound of an unfamiliar horse was enough to make a man reach for the rifle he kept over the mantel. This simmering fear created a vacuum, and into that vacuum crept a new kind of evil. Gangs of thieves and cutthroats, like the notorious Taylor brothers, roamed the countryside, preying on the very people the law was supposed to protect. They stole livestock, burned barns, and terrorized families, knowing there would be no consequences. Decent folk felt helpless, trapped between the ghosts of old hatreds and the very real threat of modern outlaws. They were good people pushed to the edge, praying for a savior. And in the smoky corners of general stores and under the shade of churchyard oaks, a dangerous idea began to take root. It was whispered at first, a desperate question passed between men who were tired of being afraid. If the law wouldn't protect them, who would? If justice was blind or simply too far away, then perhaps it was time for them to create their own. They didn't know it yet, but they were laying the foundation for a movement that would offer them salvation with one hand and deliver damnation with the other. The storm was gathering, and its name was justice. The Ozarks weren't settled, they were conquered. Not from some foreign power, but from the wilderness itself. The families that put down roots here in the generations before the war were mostly Scots-Irish, a people known for their fierce independence and a deep-seated suspicion of any authority they didn't create themselves. They weren't given land grants from a distant king. They earned their homesteads with an axe, a plow, and a rifle. Every field cleared of rocks, every cabin raised log by log, was a testament to their grit. This land wasn't just property to them. It was a part of their identity, paid for in sweat and blood. To threaten a man's land was to threaten his very soul. Then came the Civil War, and it fell on these hills not like a conventional war, but like a plague. Missouri was a border state, and that border ran straight through the heart of every family and every town. This wasn't a war of blue and gray armies marching in formation. It was the war of the torch and the rope. It was a war of neighbors. Confederate sympathizers formed guerrilla bands known as bushwhackers, while Union men became jayhawkers. They didn't fight over grand strategy. They fought over livestock, loyalties, and long-held grudges. A midnight raid could leave a family homeless, or worse. The violence was intimate, personal, and it left scars that wouldn't heal for a century. When the war officially ended in 1865, the fighting in the Ozarks didn't stop. It just lost its flag. The men who had spent 4 years living by the gun found they couldn't simply go back to the plow. Some of the most brutal bushwhackers and jayhawkers simply became outlaws, continuing their reign of terror without the thin veil of military cause. They knew the secret paths, the hidden hollows, and the fear in people's hearts. They were the war's bitter harvest, and they choked the life out of the fragile peace. This is where the weight of a name became a life or death matter. A family name in Taney County wasn't just a label, it was a history. It told people where your father stood in the war. It whispered of old debts and unsettled scores. To be a Taylor was to carry the reputation of Confederate defiance and post-war banditry. To be a Kinney suggested a history of staunch unionism. Long before the bald knobbers ever pulled on their masks, the battle lines were already drawn, etched into the landscape by the ghosts of the war. The conflict to come wasn't new. It was simply the old feud, waiting for a spark to set the hills ablaze once more. In the center of this simmering pot was Nat Kinney. He wasn't a vigilante by nature. He was a Union veteran, a respected farmer, and the Sunday school superintendent. People listened when he spoke. He saw the moral decay, the fear in his neighbors' eyes, and it offended his sense of order. On the other side were men like the Taylor brothers, who swaggered through the county as if they owned it. They and their associates were the Festering Wound, a constant source of trouble, known for their love of whiskey, brawling, and taking whatever they pleased. They were the embodiment of the lawlessness that Kinney and other decent folk were growing to despise. The conflict didn't start with a gunshot, but with 1,000 smaller cuts. An old farmer's fence would be cut in the night, his cattle scattered for miles. A man who spoke too loudly against the outlaws in the Kirbyville saloon would find his corn crib burned to the ground a week later. These weren't random acts, they were messages. One of the most galling incidents involved a public fistfight where one of the Taylors brutally beat a younger man over a perceived slight, all while the local constable conveniently looked the other way. The message was clear. There is no law here but us. Fear is a patient poison, and it spreads through whispers. In the general store, while weighing out flour and salt, men would speak in low tones. Heard the Taylors were seen near John Green's place, right before his best mule went missing. At church socials, women would exchange worried glances, sharing stories of strange riders seen on the road after dusk. Every unsolved theft, every act of vandalism was laid at the feet of the same handful of families. Rumor hardened into fact, and suspicion curdled into a collective certainty. This constant drip of intimidation and gossip created a siege mentality. The community wasn't just being attacked from the outside, it was rotting from within. The outlaws were emboldened by the lack of consequences, and the law-abiding majority felt increasingly isolated and powerless. The air in Taney County grew thick with a toxic mix of fear and resentment. It wasn't just about stolen property anymore. It was about honor, dignity, and the terrifying realization that if they didn't draw a line in the dirt themselves, the tide of violence and chaos would soon wash away their homes, their families, and their entire way of life. The winter of 1884 bled into the spring of 1885 with a strange and heavy feeling in the air. The old folks, who read the land like a book, saw bad signs everywhere. They said the woods themselves seemed to hold their breath. Panthers screamed from the high ridges with an unusual frequency, their cries sounding almost human. The screech owl, the death bird of Ozark lore, was heard calling from the eaves of more than one cabin, a sound believed to foretell a coming tragedy. A sudden violent hailstorm in late March flattened the first green shoots of corn, and men looked at the bruised sky and muttered that it was a sign of God's displeasure. But the true omen wasn't in the sky or the woods. It walked on two legs and reeked of cheap whiskey. The Taylor gang and their ilk grew bolder, their crimes escalating from nighttime thievery to brazen daylight intimidation. The final straw came when one of their crew publicly horsewhipped a well-respected farmer in front of his own family over a disputed line fence. They didn't just injure the man, they humiliated him, stripping him of his dignity in the eyes of his children and neighbors. The act was a declaration: "We are the law, and your honor means nothing to us." It sent a shockwave of rage and fear through the county. This was the moment that dread became a living thing. You could see it in the eyes of men like Nat Kinney. He felt the immense pressure from his community to do something, to lead them out of the darkness. But as he looked at the hard, desperate faces of his friends and neighbors, he felt a chilling premonition. It was a gut-wrenching feeling that in order to fight the monsters who plagued their hills, they would have to become monstrous themselves. He knew that the path they were about to choose was a one-way road, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it led straight into a darkness from which none of them would ever truly return. The public humiliation of a good man was the spark that finally lit the fuse. For Nat Kinney, the time for talk was over. Word was sent out, not by letter, but by quiet visits after dark. A trusted friend would ride to a neighbor's cabin, speak a few hushed words on the porch, and then melt back into the night. The message was simple: be on the Bald Knob, east of town, after midnight. Come alone and come armed. There was no need to explain what it was about. Every man who received the summons knew in his bones that the time for choosing a side had arrived. They gathered under a cold, star-dusted sky on a treeless hill that would give them their name. They were ghosts in the moonlight, emerging from the woods in twos and threes, rifles cradled in their arms. These were not criminals. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and church-going men, their faces grim and set. At the center of the clearing, a small bonfire crackled, casting their long, dancing shadows across the barren ground. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind and the nervous shuffling of boots on stone. Nat Kinney stood before them, his large frame silhouetted against the flames. His voice, when he spoke, was not a shout, but a low, steady rumble that carried a weight of cold fury. He spoke of the law that had abandoned them, of the thugs who terrorized their wives and children, and of the honor that was being stripped from them, piece by painful piece. "The law won't protect us," he declared, his words cutting through the night air. "So we will become the law. We will be the answer to our own prayers. We will sweep this county clean of the filth that infests it, or we will die trying." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. This was what they had been waiting for: a leader, a plan, a cause. Kinney had them raise their right hands, and there, in the flickering firelight, they swore a solemn oath. They swore secrecy upon pain of death. They swore loyalty to one another, and they swore to mete out justice with rope and switch to any man who threatened their homes and their peace. In that moment, they ceased to be individual farmers. They became a single entity, a phantom army born of desperation and rage. They were the Bald Knobbers, and as the men dispersed, melting back into the darkness from which they came, a new and terrible power was unleashed upon the Ozarks. They had a name, an oath, and a list of targets. Among them stood men like Ben Bolin, his hands still tingling from the oath, his mind already turning to the work ahead. He and his brothers were not thinkers like Kinney. They were doers. The first drops of blood had not yet been spilt, but the promise had been made. The hunt was about to begin, and the hills would soon echo with the sounds of their swift, brutal justice. Their justice was a terrifying ritual, repeated in dozens of darkened hollows. It always began with the sound, a low thunder that started far off and grew steadily closer. It was the sound of shod hooves, dozens of them, moving as one through the night. To the family huddled inside their cabin, it was the sound of a coming judgment. The dogs would bark themselves into a frenzy, then fall eerily silent as the phantom army surrounded the home. And then, the waiting. A silence so heavy you could feel it pressing in on the log walls. From the darkness would come a single, commanding voice, often rough and distorted by the flannel mask. "Come out, or we're coming in." Inside, a man would have to make a choice that was no choice at all. To surrender was to face the switch, the tar, the rope. To resist was to invite something far worse. This ritual of fear was the bald knobber's true weapon, and for a time, it worked. They drove out the worst of the outlaws and brought a fragile, terror-enforced peace to the hills. But the night they rode on William Edens, the ritual changed. Edens was not a notorious outlaw. He was just a man who had defied them, who had spoken out against their methods. He refused to be intimidated. When the thunder of hooves surrounded his cabin and the voice called out, Edens refused to open his door. He would not surrender his home to masked men. From inside, his family heard him shout his defiance into the darkness. What happened next was not justice, it was an execution. The night didn't just splinter with the sound of a kicked-in door. It exploded in a blinding, deafening roar. A volley of rifle and shotgun fire ripped through the thin wooden walls of the cabin. To the children cowering on the floor, the world became nothing but the flash of muzzles painting terrifying momentary pictures in the dark, the scream of lead tearing through wood and the smell of gunpowder filling their lungs. The air itself seemed to shred around them. When the shooting stopped, the silence that rushed back in was profound and absolute. Heavy boots stomped onto the porch. The remnants of the door were torn from its hinges. Through the smoke and darkness, the family saw only hulking shapes, demonic silhouettes against the moonlight, as their father was dragged from the home he had tried to defend. There was a final, terrible struggle in the yard, a woman's desperate plea cut short. Another shot rang out, sharp and final, and its echo was the only eulogy William Edens would receive. The next morning, when the neighbors arrived, they found a scene of unimaginable horror. They didn't need to see the body to understand what had happened. The cabin itself was the testament. It looked as if it had been clawed by some great furious beast. The log walls were pockmarked with dozens of dark, ugly holes, silent witnesses to the chaos. This was not a whipping. This was not a warning. This was murder, cold and brutal. On that night, the bald knobbers crossed a line, and in the blood of William Edens, their righteous crusade was drowned forever. The saviors had become the monsters. To understand what happened at the Edens cabin, you have to try for a moment to look through Ben Bolin's eyes. In his mind, he wasn't a murderer. He was a surgeon, and the Ozarks were his patient, riddled with the cancer of lawlessness. A tumor doesn't have rights. You don't reason with it. You cut it out, cauterize the wound, and move on. The Taylors and their kind were the primary tumor, but men like William Edens, men who defied the cure, who obstructed the surgery, were part of the disease too. In Bolin's brutally simple logic, if you weren't actively helping to save the patient, you were helping the sickness spread. The switch didn't flip for Ben Bolin on the night of the Edens murder. It had been welded into position the moment he took the oath on that bald knob. While other men, perhaps even Kinney, saw their night riding as a temporary necessary evil, Bolin saw it as a righteous calling. He was the hammer, and it was not the hammer's place to question the nail. Each whipping, each threat, each act of terror was simply a tool for the job. He likely felt contempt for the weakness he saw in others, for the men who flinched at the sound of a switch on bare skin. They didn't have his clarity. They didn't understand that to fight monsters, you must be more terrifying than any monster. So when William Edens shouted his defiance from behind that door, Bolin didn't hear a brave man defending his home. He heard the sickness talking back. He heard a direct challenge to the new order, the only order that could save them. The hail of gunfire that shredded the cabin wasn't a moment of lost control. It was a calculated, overwhelming response to that challenge. It was a message, written in lead and smoke, not just for Edens, but for anyone else who thought they could stand in the way. This was the cold calculus of his crusade. After the final shot echoed into silence, as the other masked men stood in the shocked aftermath, Ben Bolin likely felt no remorse. He wouldn't have felt the thrill of a killer, nor the chilling emptiness of a man who has lost his soul. He would have felt the quiet, grim satisfaction of a job well done. A problem had been solved, a lesson had been taught. He was the iron fist of the bald nobbers, and that night the fist had come down hard. In his own mind, he hadn't committed a crime. He had enforced the only law that mattered. Dawn broke over the Edens homestead, but the light brought no comfort. It only served to illuminate the full scope of the horror. The silence that had followed the final gunshot was a heavy, suffocating blanket. The first neighbors to arrive walked onto the property as if treading on cursed ground. They saw the cabin first, its log walls looking like they had contracted some terrible disease, a pox of dark bullet holes. On the porch, a shattered butter churn lay on its side, a mundane casualty in a night of unimaginable violence. Inside, they found what was left of the Edens family. The widow sat on a low stool, not weeping, but staring into a space beyond the walls, her mind shattered by the events she had been forced to witness. The children were huddled together in a corner, their faces pale and streaked with soot, their eyes wide with a terror that might never leave them. But it was in the yard, lying in the cold, dew-covered dirt, that the finality of the act was laid bare. William Edens was dead, and the bald nobbers had killed him. But they had made a fatal mistake. In their furious volley, they had also shot Charles Green, Edens' son-in-law. They had left him for dead, but he wasn't. He had survived. Wounded and bleeding, he was a living witness to the slaughter. And more importantly, he had recognized some of the men behind their crude flannel masks. He knew their voices. He knew their names. His survival was a ticking clock, and with every breath he took, the bald nobber's reign of terror was 1 second closer to its end. The news of the murder didn't spread as a whisper. It tore through the Ozark hills on a current of shock and rage. This was different from the stories of whippings and warnings. This was a line crossed in blood. The story reached the courthouse in Forsyth, and from there it traveled by telegraph to the state capital. The tale of the bullet-riddled cabin and the defiant man murdered in front of his family was so brutal, so brazen, that the state of Missouri could no longer afford to look the other way. The law, which had been a distant rumor for so long, finally awoke with a vengeance. The governor authorized the militia. Warrants were drawn up, bearing the names of the most prominent bald nobbers, including Nat Kinney and the Bolin brothers. A substantial reward was offered for their capture, dead or alive. The official documents went up on posts and walls in every town, turning the masked riders from a secret society into a list of wanted men. The hunters had become the hunted. The murder of William Edens split Taney County down the middle like an axe splitting a log. There was no more middle ground, no room for quiet neutrality. You were either for the nobbers or against them, and you had to choose a side right now. The pot-bellied stove at the general store, once a place for shared stories and friendly gossip, now radiated a cold silence. Men who had known each other since childhood would now pass on the road with a curt nod, their eyes hard, each wondering if the other had been among the masked riders that night. The church itself was divided, with some praying for the souls of the vigilantes and others praying for their swift damnation. From the ashes of this division, an opposing force rose up, calling themselves the anti-bald nobbers. They were not lawmen. They were the friends and family of men who had been wronged by the nobbers, joined by those who were simply horrified by the Edens killing. They armed themselves and swore their own oaths, promising to hunt down the vigilantes and deliver a justice of their own. The old Civil War feud was reborn, but this time without uniforms. It was neighbor against neighbor once more, and the hills became a checkerboard of loyalty and hate, where taking the wrong path or trusting the wrong person could get a man killed. A thick, suffocating fear settled over the county, creating a conspiracy of silence. Many people knew the truth. They had seen the riders gather, heard the boasts in a saloon, or recognized a man's horse tied up outside the Eden's place. But the bold nobbers' power, even when they were fugitives, was immense. Their kin were everywhere, and the threat of a burning barn or a midnight visit was far more immediate than the protection of a distant law. When the sheriff and his deputies came asking questions, men would suddenly suffer from bad memories, their eyes cast down to the floorboards. To speak the truth was an act of incredible courage, because everyone knew the nobbers had a very simple law for informants. Amidst this climate of fear, small acts of profound courage and startling cowardice played out in the shadows. One neighbor, at great risk to his own family, would leave a basket of bread and salted pork on the Eden's widow's porch before dawn, a silent gesture of support. But another man, bound by blood or fear, would stand before a magistrate and provide a false alibi for his cousin, swearing he was playing cards with him on the night of the murder. The community was tearing itself apart at the seams, its moral fabric tested and frayed. It was in this fractured, paranoid landscape that the real hunt for Ben Bolin and his brothers would have to begin. While the official law, the state militia, and the county sheriff made a great show of organizing and searching, they were outsiders. They knew the main roads, but they didn't know the hollows. But the real hunters, the men who moved with a purpose that was colder and sharper than any legal duty, were the anti-bald nobbers. These were men who had lived in the shadow of the nobbers' terror. They weren't hunting for a reward, they were hunting for revenge. And they knew the mountains just as well as the men they were chasing. For months, Ben Bolin and his brothers were ghosts. They slipped through the deep woods and limestone caves they had known since childhood, a landscape that was now both their sanctuary and their cage. They reverted to a primal existence, living off poached deer and foraged nuts, their clothes turning to rags. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the wind sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. They tasted paranoia in every bite of squirrel meat and felt it in the cold dampness of the caves where they slept. The familiar woods, the kingdom they once ruled with masked terror, had become a labyrinthine prison. The hunt was a slow, methodical strangulation. The anti-bald nobbers were patient. They had men among them who could track a single man across solid rock and read a broken twig like a page in a book. They moved in small, quiet groups, checking the remote cabins of known sympathizers, finding the faint traces of a recent campfire, and slowly, painstakingly, tightening the net. A farmer who gave the Bolins a slice of cornbread might find his fence cut the next week, a quiet message that help was no longer an option. The fugitive's world shrank with every passing day. The end for Ben Bolin came not in a hail of bullets, but in a moment of exhaustion. It was February 1889, and the cold had gnawed at him for months. He had risked getting close to his brother's cabin, perhaps seeking a moment of warmth, a real meal, a sliver of the life he had lost. It was a fatal mistake. A tracker for the anti-bald nobber posse had found his trail in the thin layer of snow. They didn't storm the cabin. They simply waited, melting into the grey woods, becoming part of the landscape. When Bolin stepped outside, perhaps to fetch water or check the perimeter, he was allowed to walk 20 yards into the clearing. Then, a single voice cut through the cold air. "That's far enough, Ben." He froze. From behind every large oak and limestone outcrop, a man rose, rifle already at his shoulder. There was no shouting, no chaos, just the quiet final click of a dozen rifle hammers being pulled back. In that instant, Ben Bolin, the enforcer, The Iron Fist saw the faces of his neighbors, his enemies, and knew that his war was over. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just stood there, a gaunt, tired man surrounded by the cold, unforgiving justice of the hills he once ruled. There would be no judge in a black robe for Ben Bolin. There would be no clever lawyers arguing points of law, no jury of his peers weighing evidence in a dusty box. The men who captured him, the anti-bald nobbers, had seen what passed for justice in the Ozarks. They had seen how a well-connected man could intimidate witnesses, how a sympathetic jury could ignore facts, how the slow, clumsy machine of the law could let a monster slip through its gears. They didn't trust it. They believed that to bring a man like Ben Bolin into a courtroom would be to mock the memory of William Edens. They had decided in the cold silence of the woods that Bolin would face a different kind of court. His trial was the long, grim ride from the place of his capture to a sturdy white oak tree on the side of a lonely road. The woods were his courtroom, the pale moonlight his only illumination. The jury was the silent procession of armed men on horseback who rode beside and behind him, their faces set like stone. There was no testimony offered, no evidence presented, because in their minds the case had been proven long ago, in the bullet holes of the Edens cabin, in the terrorized eyes of his family, and in the arrogance of the masked crusade Bolin had helped lead. Through it all, Ben Bolin remained unbroken. He did not beg for his life or plead for mercy. Accounts passed down through the generations say he sat tall in the saddle, his hands bound tight behind him, his gaze fixed straight ahead. His silence was his final act of defiance. He had lived his life by a code of brutal, unforgiving strength, and he would not abandon it in the face of death. He looked at the hard faces of his captors, not with fear, but with a quiet, burning contempt. He was a wolf cornered by hounds, and he would grant them no satisfaction. The verdict was delivered without a single word being spoken. When the posse stopped under the thick, bare limbs of the oak tree, the judgment was clear. They didn't grant him a final prayer or a chance for last words. The justice they dispensed was as swift and impersonal as the justice he had once delivered with a hickory switch. The rough hemp of the rope was thrown over a branch. The noose, tied with an efficient knot, was slipped over his head and cinched tight against his neck. A sharp slap on the rump of his horse, and it was over. Ben Bolin, the Iron Fist of the bald nobbers, was executed by the very vigilante justice he had championed. The question that hangs in the air, even to this day, is a chilling one. Was this justice? Or was it just another murder, another link in an endless chain of Ozark violence? The anti-bald nobbers had rid the world of a man they saw as a tyrant, but in doing so, they had become a mob, acting as their own judge, jury, and executioner. For the other captured bald nobbers, the official law would have its day in the Forsyth courthouse. But for Ben Bolin, the verdict had already been rendered, not by the law of men, but by the cold, hard law of the mountains. Ben Bolin's death was not the end of the story. It was merely the end of a chapter written in rope and vengeance. The consequences of the bald nobber war continued to ripple through the hills for years, leaving behind a landscape of broken lives and bitter silence. For the survivors of the Edens family, the mountains that had been their home became a prison of memory. Every creek, every ridge, every shadow held a piece of the horror they had endured. They could not rebuild their lives on ground soaked with their own blood and grief. Sometime after the trials, they packed what little they had left, turned their backs on Taney County, and vanished, seeking a place where the name Edens didn't echo with tragedy. For the other captured bald nobbers, the law of men finally arrived in Forsyth. The trial was a spectacle, the biggest in the county's history. And in May of 1889, 3 men, Dave Walker, his son William, and John Matthews, were led to a specially built gallows in the courthouse square. Before a crowd of thousands, they paid the ultimate price. their public execution serving as the state's final, brutal statement that the reign of the masked riders was over. But for the dozens of other nobbers who were acquitted or never charged, their freedom was a curse of its own. They walked out of the courtroom not into the arms of a grateful community, but into a life sentence of suspicion and contempt. These men, who had once been the secret kings of the night, now lived as pariahs in the daylight. Neighbors who had once feared them now simply shunned them. Their businesses failed, their crops seemed to wither on the vine, and they were met with the justice of cold shoulders and closed doors. They were haunted men, forever looking over their shoulders, wondering if every stranger on the road was a relative of someone they had wronged. Some stories say a few of them met quiet, untimely ends years later. A hunting accident, a fall from a bluff, accidents that no one ever questioned too closely. They had escaped the hangman's noose, only to find a slower, colder justice waiting for them in the unforgiving memory of their neighbors. And so, the community, exhausted by hate and bloodshed, made a collective, unspoken decision to forget. The name Bald Nobber became a curse, a word not to be spoken aloud. The grotesque horned masks were burned in secret, the records of their meetings buried or destroyed. Parents stopped telling their children the full, bloody story, opting instead for a vague tale of troubles in the old days. They tried to plow over the history, to plant a new crop of peace and pretend the soil beneath wasn't filled with bones. They wrapped the entire saga in a thick blanket of silence, hoping that if they didn't speak its name, the monster they had created would finally die. The forced silence that fell over Taney County could never last. A story this soaked in blood has a way of seeping back up through the ground. Walk through the Ozark Hills today, and you will still find the old names, Bolin, Kinney, Taylor, on mailboxes and in the phone book. The descendants of the riders and their enemies now share pews in the same churches and shop in the same stores. The blood feud is long over, the wounds scabbed over by generations of peace. But the echo remains. To carry one of those names is to carry a piece of that violent history, a faint whisper of a time when your great-grandfather might have been either the masked man on the horse or the one bolting his door in fear. The physical scars on the land have faded more slowly. For decades, the white oak where Ben Bolin was lynched stood as a dark monument on the side of the road. Locals knew it as the Bolin tree, and it became a place of dread, a landmark to be passed quickly, especially after dark. It was said that nothing would grow in its shadow. Eventually, time and nature did what the community could not. The old tree withered, died, and was cut down, its wood likely burned to ash. But even today, the old-timers can still point to the exact spot where it stood. The tree is gone, but the ground remembers. In the town of Forsyth, the old courthouse where the other nobbers were tried is gone, replaced by a new one. But in the local cemetery, you can find the graves of the 3 men who were legally hanged. Their tombstones are simple, weathered by 100 Missouri winters, giving no hint of the spectacle of their deaths. They are quiet, stone reminders of a time when the law finally brought its terrible, formal power to bear on the chaos. But the most powerful remnant of Ben Bolin isn't made of wood or stone, it is the ghost story. As the facts were buried under the community's silence, the man was replaced by the myth. History became folklore. To this day, on the dark roads around where he was killed, people still tell stories of the Phantom Rider, a lone, gaunt figure on horseback, seen on moonless nights, forever repeating his last fatal ride. Ben Bolin the man is dead and gone, but Ben Bolin the spectre became immortal, a cautionary tale whispered to children to keep them from straying too far into the woods after dark. The people tried to forget, but the story simply refused to die. So we come back to the question that hung in the air at the very beginning, a question that has haunted these hills for over a century. Was Ben Bolin a righteous crusader who lost his way? Or was he a brutal killer who simply found the right mask to wear? The honest truth, buried under years of myth and silence, is that he was both. He was the inevitable and terrible answer to the chaos that surrounded him. He was a man forged in the crucible of a lawless land, and he became the very thing he sought to destroy. The story of Ben Bolin is the story of a cure that becomes its own disease. This is more than just a tale of Ozark vigilantes. It is a timeless warning about the desperate hunger for order and the terrible price that is sometimes paid to achieve it. It is the story of what happens when good, frightened men, abandoned by the law, decide to walk the razor's edge between justice and vengeance, only to lose their balance and fall into the abyss. The bald knobbers rose from the dirt to give their community hope, but their legacy is a stark reminder that a society's saviors can all too easily become its tyrants, and that a revolution born of righteousness will almost always end by eating its own. And so the story returns to the darkness, to a lonely road and the sound of a single horse. The ghost of Ben Bolin isn't just a campfire tale meant to scare children. He is the restless spirit of this lesson. He is a permanent warning, etched into the very landscape, a silent testament to a brutal truth. In a land without law, the man who promises to save you from the monsters is often the first one to become a monster himself. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story.